The day had started like any other for the humble mechanic. His shop was small, with peeling paint on the walls and a rusty signboard that had seen better days. Inside, tools lay scattered on an old wooden bench, some so worn out they barely worked anymore. He didn't have much, but this was his life. Fixing cars was how he paid his rent, kept food on the table, and hoped to save a little for the future. Most days were slow. A car or two would roll in, needing repairs he could barely afford to do because the parts cost so much. Still, he never turned anyone away. As evening came, dark clouds began to gather over the small town. The wind picked up, carrying the smell of rain. He was just about to close his shop when he heard the sound of a struggling engine. He looked up and saw an old black car crawling toward his garage, its headlights flickering like it was about to give up. The car finally stopped right in front of his shop, steam rising from under the hood. The driver stepped out. He was a man in his 40s, wearing simple clothes, nothing fancy, but the way he looked around with worried eyes showed he was in a hurry. The rain started falling lightly, making everything shine under the dim streetlights. The man asked if the mechanic could help. He said he had an important place to be, and his car had broken down at the worst possible time. The mechanic didn't ask questions. He didn't ask for money up front either. He just nodded and told the man to wait while he checked the car. Even though it was late, and he had already been on his feet since morning, something inside him told him he couldn't let this man down. He pulled his old toolbox closer and opened the car's hood. Steam rose into his face, and the smell of burnt oil filled the air. The engine looked like it had been neglected for years. Fixing it wasn't going to be easy, especially with the few tools he had. But he wasn't the kind of man to give up just because things were hard. The stranger stood nearby, holding his coat over his head as the rain began to pour harder. Water dripped from the mechanic's hair onto his tired face, but he kept working, hands moving quickly and carefully. His clothes were soon soaked, but he didn't seem to notice. All he wanted was to get the car running so the stranger could be on his way. Time passed slowly. The rain didn't stop, and the night grew darker. Now and then, the mechanic would run back inside his shop to grab another tool or piece of wire, then return to the car, crouching low to see better in the dim light. His fingers were rough and calloused from years of work, but they moved with surprising skill. Finally, after what felt like hours, he tightened one last bolt, wiped his hands on an old rag, and stepped back. "Try starting it now," he said. His voice calm but tired. The stranger slid into the driver's seat, turned the key, and the engine roared back to life. The man looked up at the mechanic through the rain-streaked windshield, relief flooding his face. He stepped out, smiling for the first time that night, and reached for his wallet, but the mechanic shook his head. "Pay me when you can," he said softly, "or maybe help someone else one day." "That's enough." The stranger paused, clearly surprised. Most people would have asked for money right away, maybe even extra for working in the rain at night. But this man asked for nothing. He just gave a small, tired smile, like helping was simply the right thing to do. The man put his wallet away slowly. "Thank you," he said, his voice quiet but sincere. "You didn't have to." "But you did." The mechanic only nodded, already gathering his tools and putting them back inside. He didn't think much of it. People came, people went. Sometimes they paid, sometimes they didn't. Life went on. The stranger drove off into the night, his car running smoothly now as the red taillights disappeared down the wet road. The mechanic stood there for a moment, the rain still falling around him. He had no idea that this simple act of kindness, fixing a stranger's car on a rainy night without asking for anything in return, was about to change his life in a way he never could have imagined. He turned off the lights in his shop, locked the door, and walked home through the rain, thinking only about the long day ahead tomorrow. What he didn't know was that fate had already begun to write a very different story for him, one that started with a broken car, a rainy night, and a simple choice to help someone in need. The next morning, the mechanic woke up early, like he always did. The rain had washed the streets clean overnight, and the air felt fresh. He made himself a cup of tea in his small kitchen, the kind where everything was old, but worked just enough to get by. As he sipped it, he thought about the stranger from last night. He wondered if the man had made it to wherever he was going. But soon, work pushed the thought out of his mind. There were cars to fix, bills to pay, and life to keep moving. He unlocked the shop door and stepped inside. The place smelled of oil and metal, a smell he had grown used to over the years. He looked around at his tools, some of them so old they hardly worked, but he had no choice. Buying new ones cost money he didn't have. His days often felt like a fight between what needed fixing and what he could afford to fix it with. Still, he never let that stop him. By mid-morning, a few regular customers had come and gone. They were mostly local folks with old cars, people like him, trying to make ends meet. He fixed their cars, sometimes charging less than he should, because he knew how hard life could be. That was just who he was. He believed kindness mattered more than profit. Around noon, as he was wiping grease off his hands, a small car pulled up outside. It wasn't the same one from last night. This one was older, paint faded, the kind people usually drove when they didn't have much money. Young woman stepped out, holding a little boy by the hand. The car's engine was making a strange noise. She looked nervous, explaining she didn't have much money, but needed the car fixed because it was the only way she could get to work. The mechanic smiled gently and told her not to worry. He checked the car, quickly found the problem, and fixed it with a bit of wire and an old part he had lying around. When she asked how much, he waved it off. "Pay me when you can," he said, like he always did. The woman's eyes filled with relief. She thanked him over and over before driving away. The little boy waved at him from the window as they left. And for a moment, the mechanic felt a warmth in his chest. He had little, but helping people made him feel like his life meant something. Later that evening, when the day slowed down, he sat outside his shop on a wooden stool, looking at the sunset. The sky was painted in shades of orange and pink, the kind of beauty most people were too busy to notice. He thought again about the stranger from last night. There was something different about that man. The way he looked at the shop, the tools, the way he had paused when the mechanic refused money. It wasn't like most people, but the mechanic didn't expect anything to come from it. People came and went. He had learned not to expect too much from life, because disappointment hurt less when you didn't hope for big things. He just believed in doing what was right. If someone needed help, you gave it. That was it. As night fell, he locked up the shop and walked home. The streets were quiet, the lamps glowing softly, rain puddles reflecting the light. He passed by a bakery and bought a small loaf of bread with the few coins he had left. At home, he made a simple dinner and ate alone, listening to the faint sound of crickets outside. Before bed, he thought again about the man whose car he had fixed in the rain. Something about that night stayed in his mind, though he couldn't explain why. Maybe it was the way the man had looked at him before leaving, like he wanted to say more but didn't. The mechanic didn't know that while he was lying on his small bed, falling asleep to the sound of the wind. Somewhere far away, the stranger was thinking about him too. About the small, dimly lit shop, the worn-out tools, and the man who had fixed his car without asking for a single thing. In return, the mechanic had no way of knowing that the stranger was not just any man. He had no idea that the small act of kindness on a rainy night had started a chain of events that was about to turn his simple life upside down in the most unexpected way. The next day started like any other for the mechanic. He woke up early, the sun just peeking over the rooftops as the town slowly came alive. He washed his face with cold water, made his usual tea, and headed out to his small shop. Life for him was always the same: fixing cars, earning just enough to survive, and hoping for better days. He unlocked the shop door and began sorting through his old tools. The morning was quiet except for the sound of birds singing in the trees. A few neighbors passed by, waving at him as they headed to work. He waved back with a small smile, then went back to cleaning an old wrench whose handle was half broken. He didn't have money for new tools, so he kept repairing the ones he had, making them last as long as possible. By mid-morning, he had fixed 2 cars, both for regular customers who could only pay part of the money now and promised to bring the rest later. He never chased anyone for payments. He believed life was already hard enough for most people, so he didn't want to make it worse. He trusted that people would pay when they could. Just after lunch, when the day had grown hot and quiet, the sound of several expensive cars suddenly filled the street. They stopped right in front of his small shop. The mechanic looked up, surprised. No one in this neighborhood drove cars like that. Out of the first car stepped the same man whose car he had fixed in the rain. But this time, he looked completely different. He was wearing a sharp suit, his shoes shining, and he carried himself with the confidence of someone important. Behind him were 2 assistants, both holding folders and talking on phones. The mechanic wiped his hands on a rag, confused. He wondered if maybe the man's car had broken down again. But the stranger smiled warmly and walked toward him. "Do you remember me?" the man asked. The mechanic nodded slowly. "The car from the other night." "Yes," the man said, his smile widening. "You fixed it when I was stuck. You didn't even ask for money." The mechanic shrugged. "You needed help. I just did what anyone should do." The man looked around at the small shop, the cracked walls, the old tools lying on the bench. He seemed to be studying everything carefully, as if each detail told him a story. Then he turned back to the mechanic. "I never told you who I was," the man said finally. "That night, I was on my way to sign one of the biggest contracts of my career. If I hadn't made it there in time, I would have lost everything. Your help saved me." The mechanic listened quietly, unsure what to say. The man took a deep breath. "I'm the CEO of a large company. That contract changed everything for us, and you made it possible. I've been thinking about how to thank you ever since." The mechanic shook his head. "I don't need anything. I was just glad to help." But the man smiled knowingly, like he had expected that answer. "Still," he said, "I want to do something for you. Something big. Something that will change your life the way you changed mine." The mechanic stared at him, stunned. He didn't understand what the man meant. What could someone like him possibly do for a simple mechanic with a small shop and old tools? The man glanced at his assistants, who immediately opened one of the folders they were carrying. Papers rustled in the warm afternoon breeze. The mechanic stood there, heart beating a little faster now, as he realized something extraordinary was about to happen. He didn't know exactly what it was, but he could feel that his life was about to take a turn he had never even dreamed of. The mechanic stood frozen, staring at the stranger and the neat stack of papers his assistants held. His small shop felt even smaller now, with those shiny cars parked outside and people in suits waiting for the man's signal. The air was warm and quiet, except for the sound of a pen clicking as one of the assistants held it ready. The man turned to the mechanic with a calm smile. "You helped me without asking for anything," he said softly. "But I saw everything that night, the rain dripping on your face, the old tools you used, the way you worked hard even when you had so little. That kind of kindness deserves more than just a simple thank you." The mechanic opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. He was not used to big talks or fancy promises. His life had been simple for so long that he didn't know how to respond to something like this. The man continued, "I own a company with a huge fleet of vehicles, hundreds of them. They always need maintenance and repairs. I want you to be the one to handle it all. From today, this shop will be the official partner for my company's vehicles. The mechanic blinked, not sure if he had heard right. My shop? He asked slowly. Yes, the man said with a smile. But not like this. Not with old tools and cracked walls. I want to rebuild this place for you. New equipment, more space. Whatever you need. I want to turn this small shop into a proper garage, one that matches the hard work and honesty you've shown. The mechanic felt his throat tighten. He looked around at his shop, the faded signboard, the old shelves, the broken chair he sat on every evening. This place had been his whole world, but it was always a world of just getting by, never more. The man handed him the papers. This is a partnership contract, he explained. It gives you regular work for my company. Enough to keep your business running for years. And this, he pointed to another page, is the plan for rebuilding your shop. My people will handle everything. You just keep doing what you do best. The mechanic's hands shook as he held the papers. It felt unreal, like a dream he might wake up from any moment. Why? Why would you do all this? He finally asked in a quiet voice. The man looked at him kindly. Because people like you remind the world that kindness still matters, he said. That night, you didn't care who I was. You didn't know I had money or power. You just helped because it was the right thing to do. And the world needs more people like that. The mechanic's eyes burned as he looked down at the papers again. He had lived his whole life fixing cars with tools older than him, always wondering if things would ever get better. And now here was a chance. So big it scared him a little. The man placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. Sometimes life gives back in ways you never expect, he said. You gave your time, your effort, your kindness. Let life return it to you now. The mechanic nodded slowly, his voice trembling as he said, I don't know what to. Say yes, the man replied with a smile. Say yes, and let's build something great together. For the first time in years, the mechanic felt like the weight of his struggles was lifting. He looked around his tiny shop, then back at the man who had started as a stranger in the rain, but now felt like someone sent by fate itself. With a deep breath, he nodded. Yes, he said softly. Yes, the man smiled wider. He turned to his assistants. Let's get started, he said. This place is going to be unrecognizable in a few months. As the expensive cars drove away, leaving behind dust and a heart full of hope, the mechanic stood in the doorway of his shop, holding the papers close. For the first time, he let himself imagine a future that was bigger than just surviving. And deep inside, he knew life was about to change in ways he had never dreamed possible. Weeks passed, and the sound of change slowly filled the humble mechanic's life. What was once a small, worn-out shop with broken tools and fading walls turned into a place buzzing with workers, builders, and the promise of something new. Every day, trucks brought in materials. New equipment arrived one by one, shiny machines he had only seen in magazines before. The mechanic watched it all with quiet amazement. He had spent years struggling to fix cars with whatever little he had, never even daring to dream of a shop like this. Now the walls stood tall and clean, the floor gleamed, and the new signboard above the entrance proudly carried the name of his garage. For the first time in his life, he hired people to work with him. Other struggling mechanics from the town came looking for jobs, men who had been through the same hardships as him. He welcomed them with open arms because he knew what it was like to need a chance and not find one. Now he was the one giving that chance. One morning, the man who had started it all, the CEO, returned to visit. He walked into the bright, modern garage with the same warm smile. The mechanic shook his hand firmly, his heart full of gratitude. You kept your word, the mechanic said softly, looking around at everything the garage had become. The CEO nodded. And you kept yours, he said. I heard the company vehicles are running better than ever under your care. The mechanic smiled. He had worked hard these past weeks, making sure every car from the company was handled with care. He felt proud of the trust given to him. The CEO looked around at the busy workers and the customers waiting in line. "This is just the beginning," he said. "There's a whole future ahead for you now." The mechanic's eyes softened. He remembered the rainy night when all of this had started, how he had simply fixed a stranger's car without asking for anything, thinking it was just another ordinary day. He had no idea it would turn into this. Business grew quickly. People from other towns started coming because they heard about the new garage and the honest man who ran it. The mechanic made sure his workers treated every customer with respect, no matter how small the job. He never wanted to lose the kindness that had brought him here. As months passed, the mechanic's life changed in ways he never imagined. He paid off his old debts, fixed his little house, and even helped his neighbors when they needed it. The shop earned more money than he had ever dreamed of, but he didn't let it change who he was. He stayed humble, living simply, helping quietly because he knew how it felt to have nothing. One evening, as the sun set behind the new garage, the CEO visited again. He watched as workers laughed together, fixing cars under bright lights, the smell of oil and new paint filling the air. He turned to the mechanic and said, "You know, that night in the rain, I thought I was the one being helped. But looking back, maybe life brought us together so both our lives could change." The mechanic smiled faintly. "Sometimes," he said, "a small thing turns out to be the biggest thing of all." The two men stood there for a moment, watching the shop alive with work and laughter. It was hard to believe how far things had come from that quiet night when a broken car had stopped outside a tired little shop. Years later, people in the town still talked about the mechanic's story, the night he helped a stranger without knowing he was a powerful man, and how that kindness had come back to him in ways no one could have imagined. But the mechanic himself never told the story with pride. When people asked, he just smiled and said, "It was nothing big. I just fixed a car." Only he knew how that one simple act on a rainy night had changed his entire life forever.